The Flash's 9th and final season has been very disappointing for the most part. There has been a good episode or two, but the poorly conceived arcs, the insane amount of filler, the minimal Barry Allen, and the focus on the awful supporting cast has given us one of, if not maybe, the single worst season of this show. Its final arc started strong, but quickly fell apart in its second and third episodes, leading into this final episode, which has an interesting concept of bringing back all the old speedster villains in Flash's final battle, but did the series finale hit the mark? Well, you could already tell from the title, the thumbnail, and if you've seen the episode, you know, no, this episode, this series finale genuinely sucks. Hell, even the title of this episode is trash. I mean, A New World Part 4 Finale, it might be the single least creative title for an episode of this show ever, and it's the series finale. No episode of this show is called My Name is Barry Allen. They could have gone with that, or maybe Run Barry Run, or they do mention the Believe in the Impossible speech. They could have named it Believe in the Impossible or something. Something that's sentimental or fitting at all for this show, but they just go with a fourth part to the arc and finale. Alright. Now, I do have a lot of negative things to say about this episode, so let's actually start with the positives, because they do exist. This episode has some things going for it. I think the episode started rather strong, first with the Believe in the Impossible thing, which I did like that callback. Even if they called back to it like 2 more times this episode, at that point it got annoying, but also, I like the scene that brought together the evil speedsters from the past, which gave them some very interesting and fun interactions, even if the writing could be a bit goofy, which was particularly unfitting for Zoom. It's not an amazing or perfect scene or anything, but it was at least a promising start to this Legion of Zoom concept they brought together. Unfortunately, this is pretty much where the concept peaks, but I'll get back to that once I finish with the positives. Unfortunately, that will be pretty soon, because there's kind of only like 1 or 2 other positives to this episode. One of them is the only non-music related, consistently good thing about this show throughout basically its entire run: Grant Gustin. No matter how shitty the writing or the visuals get, no matter how bad the material he's given is, Grant Gustin never doesn't manage to outact everyone else on this show, and he's officially cemented himself, in my opinion, as the quintessential Barry Allen casting. Even if the character he plays is not consistently written well, Grant Gustin always does a good job, and that is definitely true for this episode as well. Grant does a great job showcasing Barry's frustrations, his anger, and his happiness. In an episode where he is asked to do all of that, Grant is just fantastic. I should also say, I don't mind Barry's ending either. I'd say easily the best thing about this episode, the only thing that made me feel anything after these 9 years of build-up, is Barry and Iris's happy ending. It genuinely felt earned and well-deserved, to the point where I'm kind of glad it ended that way. Even Barry sharing his power to a few other comic book speedsters like Avery Ho, Max Mercury, and Jess Chambers, I like that ending. Basically, when Barry is allowed to be the focus, and when the episode focuses on his and Iris's ending, the episode is genuinely good. Unfortunately, the episode is brought down to such a low point by everything else that the good is barely noticeable. The Legion of Zoom, as they're called on this show, despite that name not making any sense, I mean, only one member is Zoom, and he's not even the leader, is just profoundly disappointing, but in such a way that feels just par for the course. Zoom's writing and the way he was directed makes him feel like a parody of his former self. Savitar never unmasks himself, which is disappointing, plus he was changed from blue to red for no real explainable reason. Eobard Thawne never wears his mask for some reason, and Tom Cavanagh's take on the character remains a shell of its season 1 self, and Godspeed, well, he's always sucked, and he remains an awful character in this episode. Obviously though, the worst, most disappointing, but also least surprising part of the Legion of Zoom are the way they're defeated and the people they are put up against, the goddamn supporting cast. In these terrible CGI fight scenes, each former speedster main villain is embarrassed in an easy and quick defeat one by one at the hands of what is just the worst group of superheroes ever. Zoom being super easily defeated by Keone, who's able to just absorb and shoot back lightning, one hit of which which defeats Zoom while Chillblaine just sits back and does nothing, is just incredibly lame. It's undeserved, such a random final fight for the return of Zoom, who doesn't get to do anything cool. Savitar's fight with XS was fine, I guess. At least it was a speedster versus speedster fight, so it kind of makes sense, but it felt so impersonal for a fight that is basically between a daughter and her father in yet another super easy defeat, where Savitar is defeated for some reason as he's stabbed not like in the body or anything, but by the way it looks, he's just stabbed on the armor. Alright. Thawne just goes to kill Chester. It's not a good sign that I'm cheering for the villain to kill one of the heroes, and I am so disappointed when he doesn't die. That happens basically every time these characters are in any danger. I'm just cheering for them to die. Also, Thawne is just terrible at killing people now. He's killed multiple people at a time with his lightning in the past. Now, he spends multiple minutes electrocuting one person who's just fine at the end, and then he's defeated by Allegra because these evil speedsters just love forgetting that they are speedsters. They should be able to kill all these people before those people are even able to perceive that they've been killed. This is especially egregious in what is clearly the worst part of the episode, probably the worst fight in this show's history, the fight between Cecile and Godspeed. Let me just quickly list off exactly why this is so horrendous. First of all, Godspeed remains the least threatening of the speedster villains, as he talks and moves still like a Power Rangers villain. Cecile has her costume, which the literal previous episode said she got in 2049 in her 70s, so she should not have that. Cecile also unlocks yet another new power out of nowhere. I guess she could fly now? Okay, and then she tells Godspeed, she feels his fears. I cannot tell you the cringe I felt in this moment. It was palpable. I genuinely cannot understand the thought process that goes into the writing of this time and time again after the entire fanbase tells you again and again, we hate it. What's the point of the attempted fan service in this episode, bringing back the speedster villains, if the episode also includes something that is basically whatever the opposite of fan service is, something that the fan base pretty universally despises? It just makes no sense. And then there's the actual fight between Cecile, or I guess Virtue, and Godspeed, where she single-handedly managed to defeat an army of speedsters by just flailing her arms around in a way that not only looks incredibly stupid, I cannot imagine them actually filming this and saying, yeah, that looks good, and we'll just go with that. It looks so stupid, but also, it just shouldn't work. Again, Godspeed is a speedster villain who's being defeated very easily multiple times by a person who needs to move at the normal speed of a person to do anything. It's just embarrassing, man. What is this? And on top of all these awful matchups that just do a terrible disservice to these villains, they also just do not interact with Barry like at all, and at that point, I'd rather they just did not bring back these villains at all. It also doesn't help that the villain that Barry does interact with and does fight against is just kind of lame in comparison to most of these villains in their respective seasons, aside from Godspeed. Eddie's Cobalt Blue suit is fantastic, but his rivalry with Barry is just somewhat underwhelming, and the fact that this final main villain, the final main villain of the show, was limited to being the villain of just one episode was bound to be disappointing. The interactions between Barry and Eddie are nothing special. Eddie looks really weird when he runs. His one very short fight against Barry had awful CGI, and he overpowers Barry for no real explainable reason. I mean, he just became a speedster, and of course, the way he's defeated in the end is just so lame. I don't even necessarily mind the idea of Barry convincing Eddie to his side, but I absolutely mind how easy it seemed to be. Barry barely had to say anything, but also I despise how it wasn't even Barry's idea, it was Keon's. I mean, the final villain of the show is defeated by a single sentence from Barry convincing him to stop being evil, after it was Keon who gave him that idea. If you told me a few years ago, basically before Eric Wallace was brought on, that is how the show was going to end, I would not believe you. Ever since season 6 and 7 and 8 and now 9, I'm not surprised, but I am very disappointed. I also think the stakes of this episode fall completely flat as the Legion of Zoom are swiftly defeated and Eddie kind of just goes off to kill himself. I get that Barry doesn't want Eddie to die, and I think if executed well, these more personal stakes can be effective, but I just couldn't help but agree with Mark of all people, as I just did not care if Eddie did die or not. Maybe because he's felt like a different person this entire time, maybe because he's already been dead for 8 years, but in spite of Grant's convincing acting, I just couldn't help but feel the problem problem has been dealt with the second Jay mentioned that Eddie is going to die, which is so unfortunate for the final stakes of the final episode of this show. On the flip side of this terrible Legion of Doom are the people who defeated them, the main blight of this show basically since season 6, aside from Eric Wallace himself that is, the supporting cast. Keon takes pretty center stage in how she helped defeat Cobalt Blue and as her story of becoming the protector of nature or whatever comes to an end, and despite Danielle Panabaker giving a great performance in one particular scene, I simply could not care less about the story of this particular character, a character who should have never existed, and whose mere presence is the personification of the incompetence of this show's terrible showrunner. And after becoming the Avatar, what is happening here? Keon finally returns Caitlyn her body, and while I am glad Caitlyn is alive since her death was so poorly handled, the implication left over from this scene of Keon just basically hijacking Caitlyn's body for a year is disturbing, and Caitlyn's return is so unearned. Why should I feel anything that she's back if the characters never cared when she died? Although, again, Grant Gustin does do a good job in this scene. If anything hits and if anything works, it's the emotion from Grant Gustin's acting. Chester and Allegra have much smaller roles, but they do have this kissing moment with the signature spinning around with that triumphant music where the only person who really cares is Eric Wallace. Also, Chester becomes a meta again, I guess, even though he already had powers, he already was a meta, and I do not remember for the life of me what happened to them, where they went, I just cannot remember, and I do not want to, I do not care. Finally, as per usual, however, Cecile is the worst part of the episode. I guess I did already talk about most of her presence in this episode, which is fighting Godspeed, but there is one truly baffling moment that leaves such a bad taste in my mouth. The final cut to the Flash logo scene ever is not about Barry, it's not about the Flash, it's about goddamn Cecile. Joe proposes to Cecile. I did not remember that they were not married, it's that unimportant. It was going so well, however, focusing on Nora's birth and Barry and Iris, but Eric just couldn't control his Cecile fetish. He just had to add this proposal as the final scene before the final Flash logo in this show ever. It's so disrespectful to the legacy of the show. It's just baffling. I don't understand this. I'm lost. I'm just lost for words. This episode did also have that flashback problem. It isn't as bad as usual. It is like condensed. It is a part of the narrative in the Eddie Thawne thing. The flashbacks to Barry and Iris, I guess it's fine for a series finale, although the singing, that's kind of cringe. I hate it when a person just ups and sings out of nowhere on this show, like that Bart Allen did in one episode of season 7. It's so cringy, but I guess the episode also doesn't treat you like an idiot like a lot of previous episodes of this season does. I guess it does have things that it does better than other episodes, but for what it is, this is what we get. The final ever episode of not just The Flash, the final ever episode of the Arrowverse is this poorly conceived, terribly written, disappointing mess of an episode that fumbles its attempted fan service and makes it obsolete anyway with a focus on things the fanbase universally despises. The CGI and fight scenes are awful, the stakes fall flat, the supporting characters are awful, the main villain is underwhelming, and Barry simply does not get the final fight he deserves. Barry and Iris' happy ending is nice, and Grant Gustin proves yet again that he deserves so much better as he does his damnedest to carry this show on his back, but it's just nowhere near enough. The Flash's series finale is a genuinely horrendous series finale and a bad episode in general that I'd give a 4 out of 10. Such a sad ending to a once great show that held a strong place in my heart that truly fell from grace.